I think with the pluralism comes a pluralism of approach, and we've already said there's an evangelical instinct towards preaching the same message but doing it in a different way in different generations. And what we've contributed to that conversation is to say, as we attempt to do that, let's include younger voices in our discussion about how we adapt to the new world.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is fantastic to have you along with us, as always, whether you are watching us on YouTube or listening to us on your favourite podcast app. And I have another one of my favourite people with me, Stu Crawshaw. How are you?
I'm very good, Joel.
That's excellent. We don't have Tim joining us today. He unfortunately got COVID, so he's not able to. He has to isolate for this moment. We did talk a few weeks ago. It's like something that we have to deal with rather regularly at the moment.
And he's all right. So
yes, he's all going fine.
Symptoms aren't too bad.
Yes, excellent. But we are here to continue to talk about whatever happened to evangelism, Stu. And we always we thought we might a draft title that you came up with just then was the iPhone evangelism.
Yeah, well, we're looking at the decade where the iPhone came and what happened in the decade and how the iPhone changed evangelism. Yeah, changed social communication with social media coming on the fore. We've also got big things happening, like you mentioned last week, with 9/11 in the decade, and we've also got the new atheist movement emerging, which created different responses. Church also became more plurified in the time as well. So yeah, looking forward to talking about all those things and much more.
Absolutely. Now, I'm glad that you brought up the plurification of culture, because one of the cultural artifacts or the stories that I thought would worth sharing today was the internet. And I thought I've got one for you if you're ready to listen, because you usually haven't, and I appreciate when you bring them to this podcast. But I thought we could start talking about the internet, as you were saying. And I thought an interesting moment for me was growing up. I was always very much into sport, and I kind of just followed the sport that my dad was into. And then there's the usual things of rugby league, and we watched a lot of rugby union too as well, but especially Australia games. But the one that he really got me into was motor racing, which is a little bit more left field. So really got into that. But what was interesting when I got into you get into high school and you start thinking for yourself a little bit more and trying to define yourself as and your identity and things like that, was I really got into football. And one of the main reasons was because of the internet. You didn't just have to consume it on SBS. Obviously had a lot of football at that time, but also the Premier League was really on the rise, and I decided that I had to find a Premier League team. And it's lucky that I'm wearing a Liverpool jacket today, because that's the team that I chose and still support them today. But the thing that really developed my supporterism, the fanship, was the internet. Supporterism, neither of them are words. I don't think
they could be new ones.
Yeah, my fandom was being able to read people from overseas commenting on the game of football. And I remember clearly that there was this period where we would all get the Champions League draw, and I remember clearly a free period that we had where we were just sitting in the playground, or it was a free period, or a teacher didn't turn up or something, and I'd written all the games down that were coming up, like literally all the groups. So there was 8 groups in the Champions League, and we went through all of them during that period. It's like, no, this team's going to make it, this team's going to make it. And the only reason I could do that was because I could access that information on the internet. And it was a much more real time. When the draw came out, you could actually get the draw straight out, rather than you have to wait for it to be in the paper the next day and all that kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting example of like that. And now I'm such a football supporter now, but I wasn't prior to that. So the internet was a catalyst for actually making me really interested in football, and be able to jump on forums, to read match reports, like almost the night of that happened, really changed how I supported football. And you're a football supporter. Did the internet change how you consumed football as well?
It did, actually. Yeah, I had a slightly different story, that my dad actually introduced me to football because he came from England and he emigrated to Australia in the 1960s. And when I was little, my dad introduced me to his soccer team or football team in England, and that's Sheffield Wednesday. So when you were researching and finding out new things about teams and getting into that yourself, for me, the 2000s was more immediacy for the support I could give for the team, because when I was younger, when I was in primary school in the 1970s, we'd order a shirt from England and it'd take months or weeks or whatever to come out. And then we get it. That was a big deal. The reports of the games, the only way we had any access to reports of the games was to read the Sydney Morning Herald results on the Monday morning. So I remember going to my dad's paper every Monday and turning to the back page and looking for Sheffield Wednesday results. It
was right in the back
page
with all those results that they used to put
Yeah,
in.
they did.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was the thing called Match of the Day, which was a TV show on the ABC. So you got a snippet of a highlight, and every now and again you'd get your team would be on for the full match, which would be pretty exciting. And then in the internet era, of course, like all of a sudden I can meet fans. I got in touch with the chaplain for Sheffield Wednesday, became friends with him, and before too long in the 2010s actually, he's tweeting me from the stands in the crowd telling me what's happening and where that player was and why that went off and all this kind of cool stuff. So, it's just more immersive experience. And then, of course, we saw every game if we wanted to. Almost everything was on the internet. So,
and you learning about Sheffield Wednesday from your dad, that's the traditional way of how supporterism, as I said, was
fandom.
Fandom was passed on through generations of families like that. But I was... For example,
you came to it yourself.
Yeah, I came to being a Liverpool supporter myself, and then I got my dad on board to be a supporter of Liverpool.
And then he's into it now.
Yeah, that's right. So
there you go.
we're going to watch the Champions League final together when he comes here to Australia because he lives in the US. Anyway,
that's awesome.
The other thing probably worth putting in there is the iPhone. Do you want to talk about that? Because you and I are both quite Apple fanboys. We're sitting here with two Apple computers.
If I'd have thought about it, I could have brought in something that predated the iPhone, which was Apple's first crack at it, which was called the Newton.
Yes.
And I bought one of those earlier in the decade, and it was a dog. It was terrible. But I've kept it for sentimental purposes.
But that's a non-Steve Jobs product, wasn't it?
I didn't know that.
I believe so. That. I believe that Steve Jobs was ousted from Apple, and the Newton was, or maybe they started with Steve Jobs, but
because he was out of the company for a while.
It was the
so they developed it while he was away.
CEO who used to be CEO of Pepsi.
Who took over.
And Steve Jobs had groomed him to take over and stuff, but it obviously wasn't happy and probably started the decline of Apple to actually bringing Steve back.
Yeah. Then they started the iMac, and then that developed to the iPod, and then that developed to the iPhone. It was a very, very heady era for Apple fans. Yeah, but I think what we've been saying in the shock absorber, Joel, is that either a new technology or a crisis in the culture creates new culture. So if there's been a depression or a war or a significant cultural shock, then that can lead to a change in the way people see the world. Or a new technology like the iPhone equally can change the way people relate to each other, because before the iPhone, we used to have telephones that were hanging on the wall at home that were landlines, and if you rang me on my landline, you would leave a message on my answering machine if I had an answering machine. But if you didn't have an answering machine, you just had to keep ringing until you got onto someone. And now you've got this phone where you can take phone calls wherever you are. So one interesting outcome of the iPhone is that younger people since the iPhone have had a higher expectation of communication than my generation. So if I went to school at high school and I rang my mate to tell him something and I didn't get onto him, I didn't even care. I just wait till I see him the next day. And it's very rare these days that I would actually think like that. So there's a good example of how culture has changed because of this invention. And the thing about the shock absorber that's really good is that people like me are what are described as digital immigrants, because when I was younger, I didn't have the internet, I didn't have digital social media and iPhones, and so I've immigrated into that. Like my father immigrated from England to Australia and had to learn a new culture when he came to Australia. The new culture created by iPhone means that I need to learn it and relearn it as it continues on. But younger people like my sons, they actually grew up with technology, particularly my second son, Elijah, who's now just turning 18. iPhones have been and screens have been ubiquitous. So he's a digital native, whereas I'm a digital immigrant. So what's interesting about this time is it's a massive epoch in the 2000s, because not only has the iPhone come along, but we talked last week about 9/11 being a big cultural shift too. And just like you were talking about finding a football team on the internet, so 9/11 was a pivotal moment around the world where extremists started to spread their extreme ideology around the world through the internet, and that became quite a massive cultural thing as well. So the shock absorber is helpful because we need young people who are digital natives to be able to help people who are digital immigrants to understand what's going on with that change. And also when there's a big cultural shock like a extremist event like that, sometimes it's the older people who can bring big biblical wisdom to that event that can help the younger people adjust to it. But no matter what, the culture just keeps changing, and so we need to keep adapting. So our evangelism in this era, it's going to be fascinating today actually to talk about evangelism, because we've got these two major moments happening, the 9/11 and the iPhone, but then there's so many other things like the rise of new atheism, and there's also the new social media that comes with iPhone as well. So it's a very intense time of change, which I think explodes into the 2010s actually.
Yeah, and I think, I graduated high school in 2004, so that's a kind of the era we're talking about. But I find it interesting comparing to what Tim was talking about, how there was an evangelical counterculture being created for what was going on in the culture, that I think maybe I may have been on the end of that, I'm not sure. But I also came from a non-Christian family. But I find it interesting that it was, at my time, it was very much you just do whatever you want. But even if you were a Christian, you're a little bit on the outer. You really don't know what's going on within, not society, but I'm talking about when we're in high school. It was kind of like, oh yeah, they're Christians and they can stay over there, and that's about it. I didn't experience too much people giving me a hard time. But I think it was also, I don't think I was that apparent. Wasn't that apparent that I was a Christian. I was just wondering, you've seen this period kind of as technology, it shifts after 9/11, it shifts to like a technological age. We also talked about the end of an era in terms of like America had won in a sense. How did that influence?
Because of the fall of the USSR in the late 80s, yeah.
Exactly. And we also, Francis Fukuyama talked about it being the end of history almost.
Yeah, there was this sense that liberal democracy would just now have an unimpeded rise that would spread across the globe.
And I think that plays into what I was thinking about with school, was that it was a similar vibe. I think that there's a similar feeling of like there's not much to worry about, except for maybe the 9/11, probably the terrorism, extremism aspect, but your day-to-day that's not something you need to worry about. So everything is going to be progressive and everything is going to be great, and we're all going to just enjoy our lives and do whatever we want. I think that's where I kind of making that observation. I was just asking though, that how did you see that play out in terms of ministry? Because you talked about the 90s, you were looking at community was really important. Do you think that these shifts that we're talking about after 9/11 changed that feeling, that community wasn't as important, it was more individualistic?
Yeah, well, as we've been talking about this season, there's a bit of an evangelical line that goes through history, and evangelicalism continues to morph and change as it goes through, and sometimes it splinters. So we've already talked about the fact that Protestantism emerged after the Reformation, and after the Protestantism emerged later down the track, Protestantism goes down different highways, if you like, and maybe some prominent ones is a charismatic highway, the fundamentalist highway that we're talking about, the evangelical groups that continue to preach the gospel, and that led to the Great Awakenings that we talked about in earlier episodes. But also there's the liberals that created a modernist Christianity as well, and so the diversity of the Protestant response to cultural change continues to diversify as well. So if you look at evangelicalism by the end of the 1990s, you can see that there is evangelicalism and there's fundamentalism side by side, and there is this liberalism of Christians who have lost the confidence in the Bible that the evangelicals have, and then the fundamentalists that in a way are adding to the confidence of the Bible by saying let's get politically active and let's get angry about the cultural issues that are happening in our time. Well, by the time the end of the 90s, a lot of Gen Xers are starting to feel dissatisfied with the expressions of baby boomer church that had been passed down to them. And so the baby boomer generation that had been having all these different divergent expressions now see the Gen Xers actually trying to assert themselves as people who are asking new questions. And coming out of the decade of the 90s, there is a group of Christians that are actually dissatisfied with church, with local church. Sometimes they've had a bad experience of church. Sometimes they've had an argument with a leader in church, or it might just be a theological thing. But there is this beginning of, first of all, within youth ministry, this search for different ways of doing youth ministry, and that then flows into different ways of doing church. So people are asking the question, is there any other ways of doing church? And this coincides with the end of the century. And in the early 2000s, already by that time, we get this church planting phenomena of the emerging church, where emerging churches are starting to spring up as different kinds of churches, different new expressions of church.
What did that end up looking like? I mean, what is the reaction to the traditional expressions of church, and why did they end up wanting to do it differently, and how did that look?
Yeah, well, we're dealing with a culture that's postmodern. So part of postmodernism is deconstruction. So deconstruction is taking something that is known and changing how you see it. So, for example, Batman was released in 2008. The Dark Knight, I think it was, with Heath Ledger, was playing the Joker, and almost the Joker, who had been a villain throughout the whole of the 60s right up until then, almost becomes an anti-hero in the movie. And Heath Ledger's role in that, which was critically acclaimed, and actually some say even led to him losing his life because he was so into the character. Interesting story we could talk about another time. But this idea of the Joker in Batman being almost as prominent in the story as Batman is a good example of deconstruction. So also Batman is deconstructed from his origins, particularly from the 60s, the real slapstick sort of Batman that was really friendly and happy and wore bright colours. Now Batman is wearing black and he's very moody and dark, and he himself is struggling with his inner demons as well. So this idea of deconstruction sort of brings about a certain kind of honesty, I suppose, like that the world isn't either the guys wearing the white hats or the guys wearing the black hats, that there's this somehow that sometimes the guys with the white hats don't do the right thing either. So you've got this situation where Christians are saying, well, what does all this cultural change mean for us? And as we said, there are particularly younger Gen X leaders who are starting to ask questions about the seeker service model, asking questions about the church as event. Do we need to have church as this big event, or is it more about relationship? And I first came across it in the late 90s when some of my friends started a church called Cafe Church in Newtown. Okay. And it was quite interesting to hear them talking about their experiment, because they didn't actually have a church service at all. They sat around tables, drank coffee, and someone gave a talk, and it sounded a lot more like what the hippie churches, the 1970s Jesus movement coffee houses were like. So there were some in Sydney called the Attic. Some people gathered at this attic and they got together and they drank coffee and they just heard some artists sing, and then they heard someone give a talk. There was also in Australia the House of the Gentle Bunyip, which is a funky title. The Purple Door was another one. And these were also springing up at a time when the hippie communes were coming about. So it was almost like a Christian's response to a commune, which is where young people were dropping out of society to start their own societies in these small little ideas. There's also the house church movement that's coming along in the 70s, where people are stopping meeting in big church buildings because it's the people who are the church. So they're meeting in homes, as they said was relevant to how they read Acts 2, when people were meeting in different homes. So the house church movement, the Jesus movement, were kind of shadows of this emerging movement that would come along. But now some of my friends were meeting in a cafe. Some people met in pubs. And before I knew it, I'm realising that there's actually a name for these kind of groups, and they're called the emerging church. So they're emerging new ideas on how to do church that are happening around that time.
Right. I mean, do you think that's Tim talked about the evangelical subculture. And do you think this was all a reaction to what was going on in the culture at the same time?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so I think there was a sense in my generation that maybe Christianity had become a little bit too commercialised and a little bit cheesy and not real and a bit plastic. And so there were some who were saying that, and there was this sort of search for something that had more meaning, and it actually was driven by evangelism, because they're saying maybe the evangelical church is becoming further and further disparate from the rest of Western culture. So maybe we need to put church in the culture. And there were leaders like Alan Hirsch who were arguing for this kind of thing. There were churches like Mars Hill, which were set up by Mark Driscoll, that were set up to be very different. But in Australia, Mark Sayers on his podcasts, This Cultural Moment, talks a bit about how his early journeys in church, if I understand it correctly, were from within this kind of context of people looking to say, let's do church differently. And there's all these experiments that they were doing. There were things like, let's have an arts night, or let's go up the pub and do church over a beer, or let's have, all these different expressions that we now feel free to be able to do if we take ourselves and free ourselves from the liturgical structure of other generations. And so all these different experiments are taking place, and people are looking for something that might be transportable that can be used in other places.
I think I just find that interesting that you're talking about experimenting. We, a couple of episodes ago, said that experimentation was perhaps a mark of being along that evangelical line. Is that what you think people were trying to do? And as a church planter yourself, how do you view this kind of way of doing church, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, well, that was an interesting question, because back in the late 90s and right through the 2000s, I was actually really happy being a youth minister, and would have happily been a youth minister for the rest of my working life. I was invited to church plant after I resigned from Guymer Anglican Church in 2010 or 11 around there. Yeah, 2011. And, that's another story, but for a bit later. But the mindset I had at the time was, do we actually need to create new churches, or do we as young people within our churches need to have a better conversation with the other generations in our church to help them to understand some of the impulses that we have? So within our church at Guymer Anglican Church during the 2000s, we were in a conversation with our church about what does it look like to have community within the established set up that they had set up. So we had a homogeneous unit church where there was a traditional service, a family service, and a youth service, and we kept going to the youth service, but we also started a supplementary ministry on Saturday night as a part of our church, which is more community orientated. A meal, it was a longer hangout, and to some observers it looked like an emerging church expression within Guymer Anglican, but it wasn't. It was actually an attempt by younger people to say, let's have a conversation about church where we can invite the rest of the adults in our church to it, rather than break away from the church. So where some people might have on the surface seen us trying to have our own expression, we were very diligent in trying to invite everybody just to come together in the generations. And we had an intergenerational impulse that was a bit different to the emerging church, because the emerging church was looking at, let's start a church for inner city people, hipsters. Let's start a church for this group of people. Whereas we were saying, let's try and see if we can help our church at Guymer Anglican come together around food and around singing and around a talk and around the Bible, the Word of God. So for us, we weren't really seen as part of this movement, but we weren't also part of the expression that had been before either. So Soul Revival was kind of an in-between kind of ministry.
Makes it a bit exciting, I suppose.
Yeah, it was good.
There's also, you mentioned Mars Hill and Alan Hirsch as well, and I was just, I think you wouldn't class that as part of the emerging church, but there was also a movement of church planting around that time. But they were church planting in a different way. Is that the best way to describe it?
Yeah, and we could look at some of these church planting models a bit more detail a little later on in our series about evangelism and church planting, the role of church planting has in evangelism. But for today, it's probably enough to say that these two individuals are very different to each other, and it is a really good example of how people were doing different experiments all over the place. So Alan Hirsch down in Melbourne was looking for more organic, if I understand it correctly, more organic forms of church, maybe smaller in some cases, so there was more relationship. Whereas over in Seattle, Mark Driscoll was coming out of the grunge era with his cohort, trying to create a church that was relevant to his city. And so as a result, the Mars Hill experiment emerged as a different kind of church, but it had a real rock and roll flavour. It had a real overt masculinity attached to it, and it was a really different look to that. So it's a good example of how churches are starting to plant that are different. So just like we've talked in earlier episodes about how there are different models of youth ministry, within the merging church there were different models of church that are starting to develop how you do it.
Right, and I think like we talked about how technology, in particular the iPhone and the internet, really changed how the culture actually. It changed the culture completely, and it still does, right? Yeah, and has had a huge amount of influence on it. Is that kind of similar to these two things that we're talking about, church planting and the emergent church? Is it kind of like we need to create a new way of doing church? And I know that we've already kind of said that, but did it really shift the way that church was going to be done from then forward? Because it's less traditional, isn't it? Like whether you have it in a pub or a house or a factory like we do here at Soul Revival, or is that shifting really how church is going to be done for a long time coming after that.
Yeah, I think with the pluralism comes a pluralism of approach, and we've already said there's an evangelical instinct towards preaching the same message but doing it in a different way in different generations. And what we've contributed to that conversation is to say, as we attempt to do that, let's include younger voices in our discussion about how we adapt to the new world. And so, I learn even to this day so much about social media from my kids. Now, I still remember telling them how to use an iPad, telling them how to use an iPhone, but it was really quickly that I didn't have to tell them anymore, and they were able to use it. And then it wasn't long after that they were actually becoming free tech advice for me. So it's actually really helpful, and most people would relate to that dynamic, that younger people just seem to pick up on what's going on quicker because they're immersed in it. And that's the idea. Just like a car needs shock absorbers to go over a bump in the road, so the church needs its young people to actually think about a Christian response to some of the changes in culture and then have a conversation with the rest of the church about that. So I think the challenge is that with these new church planning formats, I think the challenge was, how do we make sure that conversation takes place? And my concern is of the era that emerging churches come from a really good impulse, which is let's help people who aren't Christians in this new culture that is very different to the Christian culture. Let's help them. Let's take away any cultural barriers that might be in front of people who don't come to church. If they don't come to church, why not go to them? So that incarnational impulse that we've talked about before, that incarnational theologians would say, just as Jesus was a Jew to the Jew, let's go and be in the pub with the pub people and who go to the pub. So let's, I'm going to the school to hang out with young people at school as a young youth minister. That's that incarnational impulse. So that's good, but the communication has to be two-way whenever we change something in the church, because not only do we need to find a way of communicating with people we're spending time helping to share the truth and love of Jesus with, but we then need to have a conversation with the rest of the church and say, how does that affect you? How do you feel about that? What have you got to say about what we're trying to do? And unfortunately with the emerging church, what I saw was a lot of young people leaving the church to have these experiments. And so the reason I didn't leave the church was because I wanted that shock absorber of being able to say, hey, we're going to start going to the park to go and talk to people down the beach who are going to go for a surf. And we were able to talk to our elders about that and get their opinions on some of those new ideas. And they were able to say, hey, yeah, we tried a couple of those things. We found this didn't work. We found this worked. But I like your idea because that's different and that's helping me see it in a different way. So having that humble conversation was why I stayed as a youth minister for 20 years, because I thought rather than the emerging churches, achieved a lot of different things, but by actually staying together in an existing church and doing new experiments in the church, if the adults of the church are flexible enough to let the young people try some new things, that's a really cool outcome.
And so with that emerging church and the church planning ideas and experiments that were happening, what were some of the things that resulted from that you were able to observe? Yeah,
so as I've already said, there's a lot of disillusionment with the conservative church expressions that they'd grown up in, a lot of the institutional. Yeah, so it's a bit anti-institutional. It was a lot of the emerging church leaders sort of saw the church structures that they'd inherited as modernist, and now we're in a postmodern era, so they're saying that this is an important thing to move with that. Christian worship was really important to these new expressions, and modern forms of evangelism. So one-on-one evangelism becomes really important. Friendship evangelism becomes really important. Andrew Root talks about in his book Rediscovering Relational Evangelism, he talks about how we should be treating other people as important for who they are, not as a possible target for our evangelism. So evangelism is kind of changing in this context. There's also new issues that some emerging churches are really latching onto in a big way, which are things like social justice becomes a lot more of an important theme for many churches. Even liberation theology, which we could talk about in another podcast, which has come from South America, and there's some of these churches have less importance put on the building and more importance put on the actual people themselves.
Right.
There's also an attempt in some emerging churches, that there's another part of this impulse which has been labelled emergent churches, and emergent churches have also tended to, have a deconstructionist view of theology as well. So looking at things like universalism, do people actually go to heaven and hell, or is it just everyone is saved? How much does just how do we understand the Bible from different minority contexts? Things like that become also something that emerging and emergent churches look at. But this whole idea of deconstructing theology leads to people even personally deconstructing their own faith down the track, and it would lay the seeds of future expressions of what we now call progressive Christianity, which is another line that's now broken off from evangelicalism. So just like there are fundamentalists, now there are also progressives, which we'll talk about in later podcasts. I think looking at some of those issues that are important to church planters in that movement are really important. And I think, again, remember the impact of 9/11 had on you when you were talking about that last week. It had that impact on the church. There's this questioning about what is authority, like how safe is our concept of our society? What are the ways that we can reach people that are becoming less and less interested in going to institutional churches? So this incarnational impulse is really driving a lot of that.
And that makes a lot of sense because at the time after 9/11, terrorism was such a big thing, wasn't it? And the reason it's called terrorism is to create terror. So a lot of people were worried about that. So that makes a lot of sense. I'm just wondering, in regards to emerging church and church planning, is there anything else around the time that happened in Australia that actually was part of that? If there's anything you can remember that actually was the same as that at the time.
Yeah, well, down at Melbourne, like we said, Mark Sayers was with a group of people that were thinking through some of these issues with Alan Hirsch and others. My supervisor for my PhD, Darren Cronshaw, has written extensively about this too. And I think it's a story of just different experiments. It's just people attempting to say, okay, sure, there are some people who are just deconstructing everything, but if we actually do gather in the name of Jesus and we gather around his word, what does that look like for our generation? And my supervisor, Darren, for example, did his PhD looking at the different expressions of churches that came out of some of Alan Hirsch's encouragement to incarnational living, and looking at how much that did impact evangelism. Did it actually make a difference to the communities around, things like that? So I think what you've got is this ongoing search that I think kind of started in the 90s with Mark Center's book, The Coming Revolution of Youth Ministry, which was arguing that there'll be different ideas on how you do youth ministry. In earlier days, everyone did the same kind of youth ministry, but he's arguing in the 90s, now people are looking for new, different experiments, and there'll be all these different pluralistic versions of how you do youth group. And then I think as those youth leaders grow up, then it seems natural to me that then the impulse for young church planners who are coming out of that environment is to continue on that project in church planting as well.
And trying to cope with the speed of change that you've talked about before, and something like the internet is just going to really accelerate that speed of change as well. So
because once upon a time, denominations were what you defined your church as being a part of, but now there's this really interesting impulse towards churches of different denominations all seeking to do these different experiments and connecting up on the internet and talking to each other, meeting each other from all over the world.
And as your point about bringing up Mars Hill before, is that they became so popular because they figured out a way to put their sermons out online as a podcast.
It was a huge thing.
And it was a huge thing.
Especially when the iPhone came out in 2008.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of the iPhone, do you remember the first time you got an iPhone and what kind of day it was for you? Did you line up?
I don't remember lining up, but I remember not getting one, first of all. I don't think I could afford it, or I don't think I got there.
Because they had
there was
two versions before that 3GS came out.
Yeah,
I remember getting the 3GS.
Right.
So I think we got it around a similar time.
Yeah, I think we did, yeah. I remember watching it for a while going, wow, that's trippy. I do remember a friend of mine who'd gone over to the States and came back from holidays with an iPhone, and I was absolutely awestruck at touching this screen going, are you kidding me? Didn't even have any buttons, man. It was mad.
One button. Remember, I think
I did actually.
I remember that. I remember reading
a
Steve Jobs biography that it was a very difficult thing for the team to do, which was to create it just with one button. Now we have iPhones without a button, which is
crazy.
But,
yeah, it's crazy.
Just to think, one thing that I thought worth talking about is that the influence of the internet and people are able to access so much more information. And it led to there's the kind of movement called the New Atheists, and that obviously would have affected the way that you especially in ministry and others in ministry, and even Christians of evangelism really affected the way they would have to be able to tell people about Jesus. There is the four horsemen of the New Atheist movement, which is Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, who wrote the book The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens, who wrote God Is Not Great, and then also Daniel Dennett, who I don't know much about. I know more about the first three. What did that look like when you were a minister at the time, youth minister? Were even people within youth ministry talking about that, or is it just more of a widespread thing as a Christian?
Well, yeah. So right through my ministry, there has been atheism and atheists who have looked on Christianity as just delusional. What I think was a change within this 2000s era, when these New Atheists movement comes about, is all of a sudden it became a lot more pointed and aggressive and critical, and it just seemed to all of a sudden go, the climate for me seemed to go from, Christians are just daggy people who are not very up to date with the latest things, but they're kind of harmless, they're off there on the side doing their own thing, like you described, seeing your Christians before you were a Christian. But then what goes on, particularly with Richard Dawkins, I think in Australia anyway, with the God Delusion, is this really heavy critique on God. And so once upon a time, atheists would say he didn't even exist and, just a bit irrelevant. Now, Dawkins still doesn't think God exists, but what happens is there's this turn where there's this real critique on particularly the God of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian writings. And so particularly with the Christian portrayal of God, there's this idea of Dawkins saying, God doesn't even exist, but if he did, he's crazy. He's actually it's delusional to believe in him. It's like you believe in this big spaghetti monster in the sky. But if he did exist, he's psychopathic, he's angry, he hates people. All these kind of words were starting to be bandied around in the 2000s. And I remember being quite shocked actually when I first heard it, because being a Christian, growing up as a Christian, it sounded really quite potent, a criticism of God himself and the Bible. And so now I found that the young people I was going to school teaching in Scripture are now starting to quote some of this stuff back at us, and they don't seem to be reading it themselves mostly, but they are getting it through the internet. They're getting splices of this, that and the other. I know a lot of kids were watching YouTube. I remember YouTube coming out was massive because now people are watching these lectures by these guys. And so in Scripture they're saying a lot more that Christianity is not just untrue, it's dangerous. And I think that's the big change that takes place at the time when there's a new explosion of social media and almost anybody can say anything they want. I mean, earlier in the decade, MySpace came out and that looked like that was going to be the biggest social media platform. Then Facebook took over from MySpace. And I remember there was a little window there where people were debating which system was better and which one they were going to use. But then afterwards, MySpace kind of withered on the line and Facebook became really prominent. And then came Instagram and eventually, as you know, there's a proliferation with Twitter and TikTok Snapchat, and all sorts of things.
TikTok, yeah.
But through these social medias, the information that is critical of the church is spreading like wildfire. And so I think what is happening is right at the time after 9/11 takes place, and some of these new atheists are actually coming out more aggressively because some people of religious persuasion have flown a plane into a building. So what was then called Islamic extremism was, for the new atheists, a religious zeal that had gone way over the top, and this extremist tag starts being used in the 2000s. And so this has an impact because now these new atheists are not just saying that was an extremist act, they're saying all religion is extremist and all religion is dangerous. And people believed it because they'd seen people fly a plane into a building. And now there are all these terrorist events happening all over the world in cities. And so this terror got brought home to us in Sydney and in other cities all over the world. There were There was the Lindt chocolate siege. There was all these
London Underground,
London Underground bombing. There's all these horrific events taking place, and so in the midst of that, these new atheists are saying, "Oh, are you shocked and surprised by all this?" Well, actually, we're not, because this is coming from religion, and religion is delusional and dangerous, and God is not great. Christopher Hitchens says He's not actually great and good. There's actually this danger coming. Look at all the wars that people have fought over religion, they would say. Now, I think I read again on the internet somewhere that less than 4% of wars in history have been motivated by religious stuff, but it was almost there for a while that every war was created by religion. And so people were just saying things on the internet and saying things. It's almost like so many people said it that it became true. And so, for evangelism, we have a new challenge. And the new challenge is not just the iPhone, but the culture that is the iPhone has unleashed. And not just the iPhone, but 9/11. And not just those two things, but new movements that have emerged because of 9/11 and the iPhone, including new atheism. So this is a huge new chapter for Christian evangelism. How do we speak into this more angry atheistic environment that's becoming increasingly secular?
I'm just wondering if someone quotes Dawkins or Hitchens or even Sam Harris to you at the time, what was your response, and how were you able to handle that? Was it difficult?
Yeah, I think I took the same kind of approach that I take now, like we took in the season where we're looking at the 2010s. I think you made the point that we're still working this out, and I think that's something you heard again from Mark Sayers, that when new things happen, you've got to kind of work out what's going on. So rather than having a knee-jerk reaction to these new ways of thinking, I just kept, I suppose, the traditional evangelical approach is to continue to preach the same message, that Jesus is good, that we have all been made in the image of God, and that we are precious, that all human beings are precious, and that we have rebelled against God. And new atheism was a form of rebellion against God, I thought. So I would say, well, yeah, I mean, the Bible says there will be people who will rebel against God, but there is a solution to that. The Bible calls all rebellion against God sin, and Jesus died on the cross for our sin, and anyone who accepts him can be forgiven, receive the Holy Spirit, and live a new life and actually have the hope of eternity. And eternity is real. God is real. The other response I had was a lot of the critiques of the new atheists were about this general idea of God, like summed up with that whole what was that movement where they put like the colanders on their heads, and they reckon they pretended to be a religion by what was it called?
I don't know.
We might put it in the show notes if we can remember. But they followed the great spaghetti monster in the sky, and they registered themselves as a religion at one point, stuff like that. But while you're looking that up, the idea for me was that the critiques from the new atheists seem to be about this idea of God, but God is a person. And so what I think I changed gears in my evangelism. Oh, you found it?
Oh, Pastafarian,
that's right. I was going to say Rastafarian, but that is something completely different. Yeah, Pastafarian, and they believed in the big spaghetti monster in the sky, and they tried to register a religion, stuff like that.
Right.
Some people even tried to get their licenses with the colander on their head. I don't know what that represented. Maybe the straining of the pastor, I suppose that was, they called it.
I think so.
They just made up this crazy idea and tried to pass it off. And the idea, I think, was to laugh at religion in general. Like, you can make up anything and call it a religion. But what I was trying to counter that with was to say, well, actually, God is a person. He's not just an idea. And he's not a big spaghetti monster in the sky. He came to earth and he visited us, and he is Jesus, and he is a person. And so that's a good example of how the message doesn't change, but that real importance that we need to direct people clearly to Jesus was really important. Now, I think over the last 30 years before that, people had been in this apologetic mindset of still trying to explain to people that the Bible is trustworthy. And that's because that kind of impulse had been going on since the Scopes monkey trial, where Christianity had been discredited by science. And so people from the late 1920s on to the end of the century were trying to convince people that the Bible was reliable. And I think a lot of evangelism was coming out of that. And even one-on-one relationship evangelism of incarnationalism was saying, yeah, this is a true thing. But now in postmodernism, it's almost like this idea of truth has gone out the window, and my truth and your truth can be completely different. And so I thought it was even more important to take people straight to Jesus, not so much try and encourage them that the Bible was right or wrong and have lots of reasons why the Bible was true, which I still did. I mean, I still talked about that, and the Bible is still true. But I talk more about what the Bible teaches about Jesus at this time, and I think Jesus coming to prominence in our evangelism was a big thing in that decade.
Yeah, so with all that cultural change swirling around, you were preaching more just like there's the unshakable foundation of Jesus even no matter what's going on outside.
What's he like? So you can attack the God of the Bible from a distance, but when you meet Jesus, it's very personal. And so the Sermon on the Mount becomes an incredibly beautiful, statement of love. And you've heard it said, love you, hate your enemies and love your friends. Paraphrasing, I say love your enemies. Like, that's crazy. So people were still delighted to hear those kind of statements because they thought, don't religious people fly planes into the buildings of their enemies to kill them and blow themselves up in shopping centres? No, actually, Jesus says the way to follow God is to love even your enemies. And so I found that really countercultural. And that actually was deconstructing the popular mindset of religion being dangerous by replacing it with a mindset that actually everything we're on about is about Jesus.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And it almost breaks down that argument of the new atheists trying to point score with each other and say, "Oh, this wins," but when you've got Jesus, it transcends all that. So again, we were always talking about that. We hope that when you're on this podcast, you understand that we love Jesus and what He does for us and for everyone else. So
100%.
Thank you very much for your time, Stu. It's been a great podcast again, as usual. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone listening. We really appreciate it. You can get in touch and be part of the conversation in a number of ways, and I'm going to list them off again just in case you haven't heard them before. And this might be your first time listening, so it's probably a good time to talk about it. You can email me at joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to our email newsletter at shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to the podcast on your favourite podcast app or check it out on YouTube. You can even subscribe on YouTube if you wish. There's a Discord link. If you want to chat more in detail, you can jump on the Discord. That'll be in the show notes. And you can also might like to check out the Soul Revival Shop, where all our profits and proceeds from that go towards our Indigenous ministry partners. soulrevival.shop for that one. Having said that, thank you very much, Stu. We appreciate it and look forward to next week and finish with a one way.
One way.